My daughter begged me never to meet her future in-laws. She swore to me with tears in her eyes that they were toxic, abusive monsters who were completely cut out of her life forever. I wanted to support her, to be the protective father she needed. But when I sat in my study holding a $40,000 wedding venue invoice in my tired hands, I decided to gently ask a few questions. What I discovered about her fiancé and his so-called estranged family didn't just break my heart. It triggered a memory of a decades-old crime that sent me straight to my hidden safe. Before I reveal the sickening truth I uncovered right inside my own home, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to play the fool to protect your family from a wolf in sheep's clothing. But I was sitting in my heavy leather armchair in the study. The house was perfectly quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. In my hands was a piece of thick, cream-colored paper. It was an invoice from the country club where my daughter Rachel was planning to get married. $40,000. And that was just to rent the ballroom. Not the food, not the flowers, not the band, just the room. I have never been a cheap man. You do not build a regional logistics company from the ground up without knowing how to spend money to make money. But looking at that number, I felt a familiar protective instinct kick in. I heard footsteps approaching my study. It was Rachel, my beautiful 32-year-old daughter. Since her mother Diane passed away, Rachel had been my entire world. She used to be a force of nature, sharp, witty, and fiercely independent. But lately, over the past year since she met Trevor, something had changed. She looked thinner. She walked softly as if she were constantly afraid of stepping on glass. Her bright eyes always seemed to be searching the room for approval. She stood in the doorway, twisting her engagement ring around her finger. "Dad, are you busy?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, almost timid. I put the invoice down and smiled at her. "Never too busy for you, sweetheart. Come sit down." She sat on the edge of the sofa across from my desk. I picked up the invoice and tapped it gently. I was just looking at the country club deposit. "It is a beautiful venue, Rachel. But before I write a check for $40,000, I was thinking we should host a dinner. Just a small gathering here at the house. I would really love to finally meet Trevor's parents. We should all sit down together, get to know each other, and coordinate the plans." The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. Rachel physically recoiled. Her shoulders shot up to her ears, and her face drained of color. Her breathing hitched in her chest. "No, Dad," she said quickly, her voice rising in a panic. "No, we cannot do that. I told you they are not coming to the wedding. They are not going to be in our lives." I leaned forward, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "Rachel, honey, it is just a dinner. He is going to be your husband. I am going to be their family too. It is only right that I shake his father's hand." Rachel stood up abruptly, pacing the room. Her hands were shaking. "You do not understand, Dad. Trevor's parents are awful people. They are abusive and manipulative. Trevor spent years in therapy trying to escape their toxic shadow. They cut him off completely when he refused to follow their twisted rules. He has no contact with them. None. Bringing them back into his life would destroy him. You cannot ask him to do that. You just cannot." I watched my daughter. The fierce, confident woman who used to run board meetings for my company was gone. In her place was a fragile, frightened girl reciting lines that sounded entirely rehearsed. It sounded like a script someone else had drilled into her head. It was the language of isolation. I had been in business for 40 years. I have negotiated with ruthless corporate sharks and union bosses. I know when someone is being controlled. I looked into her desperate eyes, and I made a tactical decision. I softened my face and let my shoulders slump, playing the part of a tired old widower who just wanted his little girl to be happy. "Okay, Rachel," I said softly, raising my hands in surrender. "Okay, I am sorry. I did not mean to upset you. If Trevor says they are bad news, then I trust his judgment. We will not mention it again. I will sign the venue check this afternoon." The relief that washed over her face was heartbreaking. She rushed over and hugged me tightly. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered into my shoulder. "You are the best. Trevor is going to be so relieved." She left the study to go get ready for a cake tasting. I stayed in my chair, staring at the empty doorway. My suspicions were not just ignited, they were burning like a 5-alarm fire. I stood up and walked to the large bay window in my study that overlooked the driveway. A few minutes later, a sleek black luxury SUV crunched onto the gravel. It was an $80,000 vehicle. I knew exactly how much it cost, because I was the one who paid for it. I bought it as an early wedding gift for Rachel because her old sedan was constantly breaking down. The driver's side door opened and Trevor stepped out. He was 35 but dressed like a college kid trying to play a billionaire. He wore a custom-tailored suit that was a little too tight, expensive Italian loafers, and hair gel that caught the afternoon sun. He walked with a slick, arrogant swagger. He did not look like a man who had survived a traumatic, abusive childhood. He looked like a man who believed the entire world owed him a favor. Rachel hurried out the front door to meet him. Trevor did not greet her with a kiss or a warm hug. He simply stopped, pulled his sunglasses down, and tossed the heavy car keys at her chest. She had to scramble to catch them. He muttered something to her, and she immediately scurried around to the driver's side to park the massive vehicle closer to the garage, acting like his personal chauffeur. Trevor simply adjusted his cuffs and strolled into my house like he owned the place. Watching him, my blood boiled. I closed my eyes and let my mind travel back to 1982. I remembered the smell of diesel fuel and cheap coffee. I remembered the rusted delivery truck I bought with every penny Diane and I had to our names. I remembered my hands calloused and bleeding from loading freight boxes in the freezing rain, while Diane sat at our tiny kitchen table balancing the ledgers on a yellow legal pad. We built an empire through decades of literal blood and sweat. We sacrificed sleep vacations and comfort so that our daughter would never have to know the sting of poverty. And now this manicured, slick-talking parasite was tossing keys at my daughter, treating her like the help, while driving a car my broken back paid for. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to march out into the hallway, grab him by the collar of his expensive suit, and throw him out onto the street. But I bit my tongue. I kept my face impassive. A good chess player never flips the board when he is losing a piece. He studies the opponent. I turned away from the window and quietly opened the door of my study to head toward the kitchen. The hallway was deeply shadowed. As I passed the guest bedroom, I stopped dead in my tracks. The door was pushed open just a crack. Inside the room, standing with his back to me, was Trevor. He was holding something small in his hands. I held my breath and squinted through the narrow opening. My heart stopped beating for a full second. It was a faded blue velvet box. I would recognize that box anywhere on earth. It belonged to Diane. It was the antique jewelry box where she kept her grandmother's heirloom diamond necklace. The necklace I had promised to give Rachel on her wedding day. The box was supposed to be locked away in the hidden floor safe in my master bedroom closet. I watched paralyzed as Trevor smoothly slipped the faded blue velvet box into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He patted the pocket, flat-checked his reflection in the guest room mirror, smoothed his hair, and turned toward the door. I silently stepped back into the shadows of my study, gently pulling the door closed until it only a tiny sliver remained open. I heard him walk down the hall, whistling a cheerful tune. A moment later, Rachel called out from the foyer. "Ready to go, Trevor? The cake tasting is at 2. "Coming, babe," he called back. His voice was dripping with fake sweetness. "Bye, George," he yelled toward my study. "Thanks again for handling the venue deposit. You are a lifesaver." "Have fun, kids," I called back, injecting as much warm, grandfatherly cheer into my voice as I could muster. I waited until I heard the heavy front door click shut. I waited until I heard the engine of the luxury SUV roar to life and the tires crunch down the long driveway. Once the house was completely silent, I walked out of the study and went straight to my master bedroom. I went into the walk-in closet, pulled back the heavy wool rug, and spun the dial on my floor safe. 3 numbers, a combination only Rachel and I knew. I pulled the heavy steel door open. I bypassed the stacks of emergency cash and the important legal documents reaching straight for the back corner. My hand grasped empty air. The spot where Diane's blue velvet box had sat undisturbed for 10 years was empty. A cold, dark rage washed over me. It was a suffocating physical weight. My hands began to shake, not from age, but from pure, unadulterated fury. Trevor had not just stolen a piece of jewelry. He had violated the sacred memory of my dead wife. He had used the safe combination that my daughter must have innocently shared with him. The urge to call the police was overwhelming. I could have him arrested in an hour. I could have the squad cars pull him over right outside the bakery. I could watch them put him in handcuffs and drag him away. But as I knelt there on the floor of my closet, the cold logic of a man who spent 40 years dominating the logistics industry took over. If I called the police right now, Trevor would lie. He would play the victim. He would tell Rachel that I had given him the necklace to get cleaned as a surprise, and then called the cops because I hated him. He would gaslight her. He would use the abusive parent narrative to convince Rachel that I was just a controlling, toxic old man trying to destroy their love. And Rachel, who was already isolated and brainwashed by him, would believe him. She would pack her bags and run away with him, and I would lose my daughter forever. Trevor was not just a thief. He was a highly calculated predator who had dug his claws deep into my child's mind. He thought he had me figured out. He thought I was a tired, oblivious old man, eager to give away his fortune for a little bit of family companionship. He thought I was weak. I slowly closed the heavy steel door of the safe and spun the dial, locking it tight. I stood up and smoothed the wrinkles out of my trousers. I was not going to call the police over a stolen necklace. I was going to play the exact role Trevor had assigned to me. I was going to be the generous, forgetful, eager-to-please father-in-law. I was going not only to let him think he was getting away with it, I was going to hold the door open for him. I would smile and write checks and offer him the keys to the castle. I would wait until he felt completely invincible. And then I was going to find out exactly who he really was, and I was going to burn his entire world to ashes. I walked back into my study and locked the heavy oak door behind me. The soft click of the brass lock was the sound of a switch flipping inside my head. The tired, accommodating widower, who had just smiled and waved goodbye to his daughter and her fiancé, was gone. In his place was the man who had spent 4 decades crushing competitors and outsmarting corporate saboteurs in the logistics industry. I walked over to my desk, bypassed the polished landline, and reached into the bottom drawer. I pulled out a prepaid cell phone I kept for emergencies. I dialed a number I knew by heart. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. Blake speaking. Lawrence Blake was not a family friend. He was my corporate attorney and my personal investigator. We had worked together for 25 years. Lawrence was a man who lived in the shadows of boardrooms, a legal bulldog who specialized in making very complicated problems disappear quietly. When rival companies tried to steal my freight contracts, or when disgruntled union bosses tried to blackmail my dispatchers, Lawrence was the man I called. He did not care about pleasantries, and he did not ask unnecessary questions. Lawrence, it is George, I said, keeping my voice low and steady. George, his tone shifted instantly, losing the hostile edge and replacing it with sharp professional focus. It has been a while. Are we talking about a golf game or are we talking about a problem? We are talking about a problem, I replied. I need you to drop whatever you are doing right now. I need a full background workup and I need it yesterday. Give me a name, Lawrence said. I could hear the sound of a keyboard clacking in the background. Trevor Collins, I told him. He is 35 years old. He is currently engaged to Rachel. There was a brief pause on the line. The keyboard tapping stopped. Rachel is engaged. Lawrence asked, a hint of genuine surprise breaking through his usual stoic demeanor. You did not mention she was seeing anyone serious. Because I wanted to give the boy the benefit of the doubt, I explained, leaning back in my leather chair. He presents himself as a successful consultant. He drives an expensive car, wears tailored suits, and plays the part of a charming, devoted future son-in-law. but he just walked out of my house with a piece of antique jewelry that belonged to Diane. He stole it right out of the guest room. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Lawrence had known Diane. He knew what she meant to me. You want me to send the police to his location, George? I can have him pulled over and searched within 15 minutes. No, I said sharply. No police. If we involve the authorities right now, he will spin a story. He will say I gave it to him to get appraised or cleaned. Rachel is completely under his spell, Lawrence. He has her isolated and brainwashed. If I attack him directly, she will defend him, and I will lose my daughter. I need to know exactly what kind of snake has crawled into my house before I cut off its head. What is the angle you want me to pursue? Lawrence asked, his fingers flying across the keyboard again. Start with his parents, I instructed. Trevor claims he is a survivor of severe domestic abuse. He told Rachel that his parents are toxic monsters who ruined his childhood. He claims he cut them off entirely years ago to protect his mental health. He says they are completely estranged, living off the grid somewhere, and that they are absolutely forbidden from attending the wedding. I need you to find them. I need names, addresses, financial records, criminal histories. If they are the monsters he claims they are, I want proof. And if he is lying, I want to know exactly who these people are. Consider it done, Lawrence said. I will put my best people on it. Give me a few hours, George. Sit tight, and do not let him know you are onto him. I hung up the phone and placed it back in the drawer. The silence of the study settled around me again, but this time it was not a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a gathering storm. I walked over to the small liquor cabinet in the corner, poured myself a splash of bourbon, and stood by the window. I thought about my daughter. Rachel had always been so fiercely independent. She had inherited her mother's sharp wit and my stubborn determination. But looking back over the past year, I could see the subtle shifts I had missed. The way she stopped going to her weekly tennis matches with her girlfriends. The way she started dressing in more muted colors because Trevor preferred a modest look. The way she constantly apologized for things that were not her fault. He had systematically dismantled her confidence piece by piece, replacing her reality with his own. He used his fake childhood trauma as a weapon, making Rachel feel like she was his only savior. He made her believe that the entire world was a dangerous place, and that only he could understand her. It was a textbook psychological operation. I sipped my bourbon and let the anger focus my mind. Trevor thought he was a master manipulator, but he had made the classic mistake of a confident con artist. He got greedy. He could not resist lifting a velvet box he found sitting on a dresser. He assumed I was too old and too oblivious to notice. 3 hours later, the prepaid phone in my drawer buzzed. I snatched it up immediately. "What do you have?" I asked. Lawrence did not bother with a greeting. "George, you need to sit down for this." "I am sitting," I lied, pacing the length of my Persian rug. "Tell me everything. The story your future son-in-law sold your daughter is a complete fabrication." Lawrence began, his voice tight with disbelief. I ran a deep trace on Trevor Collins and worked backward to his immediate family tree. His parents are not off the grid, and they are certainly not living in poverty. Their names are Douglas and Patricia Collins. "Where are they?" I demanded. "They live exactly 40 miles away from you," Lawrence said. "They reside in a massive 5-bedroom property in the Whispering Pines gated community. It is one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the county. Private security, golf courses, the works." I stopped pacing. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. A gated community. 40 miles away. "Are you absolutely sure, Lawrence?" I asked. Trevor swore to Rachel that he grew up in a trailer park with parents who drank away every dime they had. He told her he had to work 3 jobs just to escape them. "It is a lie, George." "It is a 100% certified lie," Lawrence confirmed. "I am looking at the county tax records right now. Douglas and Patricia Collins purchased that estate 12 years ago for $2.5 million in cash. They hold active memberships at the local country club. They drive late-model luxury sedans registered in their names. And as for the estrangement, that is a lie, too. Cell phone records show Trevor calls them almost every single day, usually mid-morning when Rachel is at work. The sheer audacity of it left me temporarily breathless. He was not a broken survivor seeking a loving family. He was an actor playing a role. He had crafted a tragic backstory specifically designed to exploit my daughter's empathy and maternal instincts. He made her pity him. He made her want to heal him. And by claiming his parents were dangerous, he ensured that Rachel would never go looking for them. He created a firewall of fear to keep his two worlds completely separate. Lawrence continued, his voice dropping to a grim murmur. There is something else, George. I dug into Trevor's professional background. The consulting firm he claims to work for does not exist. The corporate address he lists on his resume points to a virtual mailbox in a strip mall. He has no registered income for the past 3 years. Then how is he funding his lifestyle, I asked, feeling a cold knot forming in my stomach. How did he afford the custom suits, the designer shoes, the expensive dinners? Credit, Lawrence replied simply. Massive amounts of revolving credit. He has 6 credit cards maxed out to the limit. And George Wrist checked the public records for any recent liens or judgments. Trevor is drowning. He is facing multiple civil lawsuits for unpaid debts. He is a financial sinkhole. I closed my eyes and let out a slow, heavy breath. It all made perfect, terrifying sense. Trevor was not marrying my daughter for love. He was marrying her for survival. He had found a wealthy, successful woman with a generous, aging father, and he had latched onto her like a parasite. The tragic backstory, the isolation, the stolen necklace, it was all part of a desperate scramble to secure a payday before his house of cards collapsed. Send me the address for Douglas and Patricia Collins, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. George, what are you going to do? Lawrence asked, sounding genuinely concerned. You cannot just march into a gated community and start demanding answers. These people are professional grifters. If you spook them, they will vanish and they might try to take Rachel with them. I am not going to spook them, Lawrence, I said, staring out the window at the empty driveway. I am just going to do a little sightseeing. I need to see these invisible monsters with my own 2 eyes. Send me the address. The address Lawrence sent me burned a hole in my mind. Whispering Pines. It was an enclave for old money and new predators located just off the interstate. I did not bother changing out of my slacks and cardigan. I simply grabbed my car keys and walked out to the garage. I left the polished luxury sedan sitting there and instead took the old battered pickup truck I kept for hauling garden supplies. It was invisible. Nobody looks twice at an old man in a dusty farm truck. The drive took 45 minutes. Every mile marker that passed fueled the cold fire burning in my chest. I thought about Rachel crying in my study. I thought about her trembling hands as she defended a man she believed was broken and abused. She was pouring her pure, beautiful heart into a black hole. Trevor had weaponized her empathy. I arrived at the perimeter of Whispering Pines just as the late afternoon sun began to dip behind the tree line. The main entrance was guarded by a heavy iron gate and a security booth. I knew better than to drive straight up and ask for the Collins residence. Instead, I turned down a gravel service road that ran parallel to the community golf course. I parked the truck behind a thick cluster of weeping willows, turned off the engine, and grabbed a pair of high-powered hunting binoculars from the glove box. My 70-year-old knees ached as I climbed out of the truck and navigated the uneven ground. The damp evening air seeped into my joints, but I ignored the pain. I found a small rise covered in thick brush that offered a clear line of sight down into the neighborhood. I settled into the dirt, letting the shadows conceal me. I raised the binoculars and scanned the properties until I found the address Lawrence had provided. The Collins estate was a sprawling, custom-built masterpiece. It sat on at least 2 acres of perfectly manicured emerald grass. The house itself featured massive stone pillars, a wraparound porch, and a pristine circular driveway. A sleek imported sports car sat parked near the garage. These were not the broken, destitute people Trevor had described. This was the fortress of a family living in absolute excessive comfort. I laid in the dirt and watched the house for over an hour. The physical toll of lying still in the cold, damp brush was heavy. My back throbbed and my hands felt stiff. But the anger pumping through my veins kept me entirely focused. I was not going to leave until I saw the faces of the people who had raised a thief. Just before dusk, the sound of a heavy engine broke the quiet ambiance of the neighborhood. A vehicle turned onto the street and glided smoothly toward the Collins estate. My breath caught in my throat. It was the black luxury SUV I had purchased for my daughter. The sunlight gleamed off the polished hood as it pulled into the circular driveway and parked right next to the sports car. The driver's side door opened and Trevor stepped out. He was no longer wearing the tight, tailored suit from this afternoon. He had changed into a casual linen shirt and expensive designer jeans. He looked completely at ease without a single care in the world. He walked up the sweeping stone steps toward the massive mahogany front door. Before he could even ring the bell, the door swung open. A woman stepped out onto the porch. She was dressed in an elegant flowing summer dress with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and jewelry that caught the fading light. Behind her emerged a tall, broad-shouldered man holding 2 crystal glasses filled with amber liquid. Douglas and Patricia Collins, the monsters of Trevor's tragic backstory. I adjusted the focus dial on my binoculars, praying that my eyes were deceiving me. I wanted to see tension. I wanted to see Trevor flinch or scream at them. I wanted to see any shred of truth to the horrible stories he had told my daughter. Instead, I watched Trevor smile broadly. He opened his arms and embraced Patricia in a tight, warm hug. She kissed his cheek and laughed, touching his face with clear maternal affection. Douglas stepped forward, smiling proudly. He handed one of the crystal glasses to Trevor and pulled his son into a firm back, slapping embrace. They stood there on the porch, illuminated by the soft glow of the expensive outdoor lighting. They were toasting. Trevor raised his glass, clinking it against his father's glass, and threw his head back in a roar of laughter. They looked like a picture-perfect wealthy family celebrating a successful business deal. I lowered the binoculars. The cold reality of the situation washed over me, settling deep into my bones. There was no estrangement. There was no tragic history of abuse or poverty. Every tear my daughter had shed out of pity for her fiancé was based on a monstrous, calculated illusion. Trevor had painted his parents as villains solely to ensure Rachel would never attempt to contact them. He had built an invisible wall around her, keeping her completely isolated from his real life. He needed Rachel to believe he was a victim so she would fiercely protect him from any scrutiny, and his parents were fully complicit. They were standing on their luxury porch, drinking expensive liquor and laughing with the son who was actively defrauding an innocent woman. They had to know where that $80,000 vehicle sitting in their driveway came from. They had to know how their unemployed son was funding his designer clothes. They were not just turning a blind eye. They were celebrating his successful hunt. I sat there in the damp brush, feeling a profound, sickening horror. I had spent 40 years dealing with ruthless corporate competitors, but this was an entirely different level of evil. This was a family of predators operating in plain sight. They were treating my daughter like a bank vault, and they were using her pure, trusting heart as the combination code. I watched them walk back inside their beautiful stone mansion, leaving the front door open to let the evening breeze inside. They looked so comfortable, so utterly convinced that they were untouchable. They believed they had outsmarted a naive young woman and her tired, oblivious old father. I slowly packed up my binoculars and began the painful trek back down the hill to my truck. My joints screamed with every step, but I did not care. The fatigue was completely overridden by a dark, absolute determination. Trevor wanted to play the victim. He wanted to use my daughter's empathy as a weapon against her. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had stolen from my dead wife, and he had brought his treacherous games to my doorstep. I climbed into the cab of my dusty truck and turned the key. The engine roared to life. I did not know exactly what my next move was going to be, but I knew one thing for certain. I was going to strip away every lie Trevor Collins had ever told. I was going to expose the rot underneath his charming smile, and I was going to destroy his entire family. I did not start the engine of my truck. I sat in the dark and reached behind the passenger seat. Lawrence had insisted I take a heavy black case from his office earlier that month. He told me that in my line of work, it was always better to listen before you speak. I opened the latches quietly. Inside the foam lining was a parabolic microphone. It was a sophisticated piece of audio surveillance equipment. I assembled the plastic dish with steady hands and connected the digital recorder. I rolled down the window just enough to rest the barrel of the microphone on the glass. I slipped the heavy padded headphones over my ears and flipped the power switch. I aimed the center of the dish directly at the glowing back patio of the Collins estate. At first, there was only static. Then the device calibrated, and the ambient noise of the neighborhood rushed into my ears. I heard the crickets chirping. I heard the wind rustling through the weeping willows. And then I heard the sharp, clear sound of crystal glasses clinking together. I pressed the red record button on the device. A small light began to blink, confirming that every sound was being captured and saved. I adjusted the dial to isolate the voices on the patio. Patricia Collins was speaking. Her voice was smooth and cultured, but it carried a sharp edge of pure greed. She told Trevor he was playing this perfectly. She said she saw the pictures of the venue online and thought it was absolutely stunning. Trevor laughed. He told his mother it was $40,000 just to rent the room. He boasted that the best part was that the old man did not even blink. He said he handed me the invoice and I folded like a cheap suit. He claimed I thought I was buying my way into his good graces. I gripped the steering wheel. Hearing the contempt in his voice was like swallowing glass. But I kept the microphone steady. Trevor continued talking. He said he actually brought his mother a little something. He called it a thank you gift for being so patient while he played the tragic orphan. I heard the sound of fabric rustling. Through my binoculars, I had seen him wearing that casual linen shirt. I knew exactly what he was pulling from his pocket. Patricia cooed and told Trevor he should not have done that. I heard the distinct soft snap of a velvet hinge opening. It was the sound of my late wife Diane and her antique jewelry box, the box that had sat safely in my closet for 10 years. Patricia let out a loud, dramatic gasp. She exclaimed over the beauty of the piece and asked if they were real diamonds. Trevor replied, sounding incredibly smug. He said they were vintage cut and belonged to Rachel and her dead mother. He bragged that he found them sitting in a safe I forgot to lock properly. He called me so clueless that I probably would not notice the necklace was missing for months. A deep rumbling laugh echoed through the headphones. It was Douglas Collins. Douglas warned his son to be careful, though he was clearly amused. He told Trevor not to push his luck before the ink was dry. Douglas stated the old man is writing the venue check today, but they needed the main prize. He instructed Trevor to keep the girl isolated and make sure she cuts off any friends who might ask too many questions. Then Douglas delivered the final blow. He said once the marriage certificate is signed, we drain the trust. I closed my eyes. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Once the marriage certificate is signed, we drain the trust. They had a systematic timeline. The venue deposit was just a test of my compliance. The stolen necklace was just a fringe benefit. Their true target was the massive family trust I had built over 40 years. They were planning to completely bankrupt my daughter the moment she was legally tied to their son. Patricia chimed in, her voice dripping with mockery. She said they are so desperate for a happy family. She called Rachel a lost puppy who believes every single word Trevor says about them. She laughed, saying Rachel actually thinks they are monsters. Trevor laughed right back. He told his mother that they are monsters. He said they are just the kind of monsters who prefer to wear nice watches. I watched the red light on the digital recorder blink steadily. I had it all. Every vile word, every admission of theft, every detail of their calculated conspiracy. It was captured in crystal clear, high-definition audio. I took off the headphones and placed the equipment carefully back into the black case. My hands were no longer shaking. The crushing weight of the betrayal had vanished, replaced entirely by a cold, absolute clarity. Trevor thought Rachel was a lost puppy. Douglas thought I was a clueless old Mark. They thought they were playing a game that they had already won. They had no idea that they had just handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy their entire operation. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine of the old truck rumbled to life. I drove away from the Whispering Pines community, leaving the thieves to drink their expensive liquor and celebrate their temporary victory. I had a lot of work to do, and I needed to call Lawrence again. I drove back to my house with the audio recorder resting on the passenger seat like an unexploded bomb. The roads were dark and empty, but my mind was racing faster than the engine. Douglas and Patricia Collins. The names echoed in my head over and over again. When Lawrence first mentioned them on the phone, I was too focused on the betrayal to process the names. But hearing their voices through the headphones, hearing that deep, arrogant laugh, and that cold, cultured tone had triggered something buried deep in my memory. A sickening, dark sense of déjà vu washed over me. I knew those voices. I knew those names. I did not pull the truck into the main garage. I parked around the back near the basement entrance. The house was completely silent. Rachel and Trevor were still out celebrating their cake tasting, oblivious to the storm gathering beneath their feet. I unlocked the heavy basement door and stepped into the cool, dry air of my archives. For 40 years, I kept meticulous records. Every freight contract, every tax return, every legal dispute was cataloged and stored in heavy fireproof boxes along the concrete walls. But I was not looking for my company records tonight. I walked past the corporate files and headed straight for the dusty shelves in the far back corner, the personal archives. 15 years ago, before Rachel even graduated high school, my late wife, Diane, went through a living nightmare. Her father, a hard-working machinist who saved his entire life, had his pension fund completely wiped out in an investment scam. I remember Diane sitting at our kitchen table crying until she could not breathe, holding worthless stock certificates. We hired lawyers and private investigators. We tried to get his money back, but the perpetrators hid behind layers of shell companies and offshore accounts. They bankrupted my father-in-law and pushed him into an early grave from the stress. I grabbed a step stool and pulled down a heavy plastic bin labeled Diane Family Estate. My chest felt tight as I popped the latches. A cloud of dust rose into the air. I dug through old medical bills, funeral arrangements, and property deeds until I found the thick manila folders containing the fraud investigation. I spread the yellowing papers across an old folding table. I flipped through the private investigator reports from 15 years ago. I scanned the corporate filings for the shell companies that had drained the pension fund. My eyes stopped on a legal brief outlining the primary directors of the fraudulent investment firm. I stopped breathing. The blood in my veins turned to ice. There, printed in bold black ink on a 15-year-old legal document, were the names: Douglas Collins and Patricia Collins. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my fingers ached. They were the directors. They were the architects of the scam that destroyed my wife's family. According to the old legal notes, they had managed to avoid federal prison on a jurisdictional technicality. They walked away with millions, leaving ruined lives in their wake, and moved into a gated community. This was not a coincidence. This was not a random grifter finding a wealthy target at a coffee shop. Trevor meeting Rachel was a calculated, targeted hit. Douglas and Patricia Collins knew exactly who I was. They knew the logistics empire I had built. They probably realized years ago that the son-in-law they bankrupted had a daughter who married very well. They had sent their son to finish the job. Trevor had sought out Rachel, manipulated his way into her life, and isolated her just to get access to the Bennett family trust. It was a generational financial hit. They had robbed my wife's father, and now they were coming to rob my daughter. I stared at the name Douglas Collins on the paper. The deep rumbling laugh I heard through the microphone suddenly made perfect sense. He was laughing because he thought he was beating me again. He thought he was going to drain the blood from my family a second time and leave us with nothing. I slowly folded the documents and placed them back into the manila folder. The initial shock was fading, replaced by an absolute chilling calm. I had spent the last decade missing my wife, mourning the life we built together. But standing there in the cold basement holding the evidence of her father's destruction, I felt Diane standing right beside me. Trevor and his parents thought they were hunting a vulnerable rich girl and a tired old man. They had no idea they had just walked into a trap set by a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I was not just going to stop them from stealing my money. I was going to make them pay for what they did to my family 15 years ago. I was going to tear down their $2 million estate. I was going to expose their entire criminal network. I picked up my prepaid cell phone and dialed Lawrence Blake. It was past midnight, but he answered on the first ring. "Lawrence," I said, my voice dead and flat, "I need you to pull the archived files from my father-in-law's pension fraud case." There was a long pause on the line. "George, that case was closed 15 years ago. The statute of limitations expired. Why are we reopening it now?" "Because the people who bankrupted him are currently drinking scotch 40 miles away," I told him. "Douglas and Patricia Collins are the shell company directors who stole the pension. Trevor is their son. They are running the exact same playbook on Rachel. They came back for the rest of our money." I heard Lawrence swear softly under his breath. The professional detachment in his voice vanished entirely. "George, tell me you are joking." "I do not joke about my family." "Lawrence," I replied, "I have audio of them plotting to drain the trust after the wedding. I have audio of Trevor handing over Diane's stolen necklace to his mother. And now I have the paper trail proving they are career financial predators." "What is the play?" George Lawrence asked, his voice turning razor sharp. "Do we take this to the feds right now?" "Not yet," I said, staring at the dark concrete wall of the basement. "If we go to the feds now, they might slither out on another technicality. They will hide the assets, and Trevor will convince Rachel that I am framing him. We have to let them commit a new crime. A big one. We have to let them think they have access to the accounts, so they try to initiate a wire transfer. We are going to build a honey trap." "A honey trap," Lawrence repeated. "George, you are talking about putting your own capital on the line. If Trevor gets his hands on financial power of attorney, he can do a lot of damage very quickly." "He is not going to get my capital," I said firmly. "He is going to get exactly what I want him to get. I need you to set up a secure meeting tomorrow morning. We are going to restructure my entire estate. And Lawrence, bring the federal wire fraud statutes with you. We are going to make sure that when the trap snaps shut, it takes off their heads." I hung up the phone and turned off the basement lights. I walked up the stairs in the dark, feeling a renewed sense of purpose burning in my chest. Trevor wanted to play games with my family. He was about to find out what happens when you wake up a sleeping giant. I spent the next 3 days playing the fool. It was the hardest acting job of my life. I smiled at Trevor over morning coffee. I asked him mundane questions about the weather. I watched him pour his cheap charm all over my house while his parents waited like vultures 40 miles away. But Trevor was not just waiting. He was actively accelerating his timeline. I noticed the subtle changes in how he treated me in front of Rachel. He would interrupt me mid-sentence and gently tell Rachel that I was getting confused. He would move my reading glasses when I was not looking and act deeply concerned when I could not find them. He was laying the groundwork. He was building a narrative that grief and age were finally taking their toll on my mind, and his psychological warfare was working. Rachel was exhausted. Trevor kept her awake late into the night, planning and stressing over minor details, isolating her from her friends. Her eyes were constantly red and swollen. She looked like a shadow of the fierce woman I had raised. Then came Thursday afternoon. I was sitting on the back patio pretending to read a newspaper when Rachel walked out. She looked incredibly fragile, holding a thick stack of stapled papers pressed tightly against her chest. Trevor was watching her from the kitchen window. I could feel his cold eyes on my back. Rachel sat down next to me and let out a shaky breath. She placed a trembling hand on my arm. She told me that she and Trevor had been talking and that they were really worried about me. I put the newspaper down and looked at her. I asked her why she was worried about me. She swallowed hard. She said I just seemed so tired lately. She claimed I was forgetting things and seemed lost in thought. She told me Trevor believed the stress of the wedding was too much for me, especially without her mother here to help. She said he thought they were putting an unfair burden on my shoulders. The sheer manipulation of it made my stomach turn. Trevor was using my dead wife to convince my daughter that I was losing my mind. Rachel continued pushing the stack of papers across the glass patio table. She said they wanted to take the heavy lifting off my plate. She told me Trevor had his legal friends draw up some wedding vendor insurance forms. She promised it was just standard liability paperwork that would allow Trevor and her to sign the final contracts with the caterers and the florists, so I would not have to worry about the logistics anymore. She said I could just rest and show up to walk her down the aisle. I looked down at the documents. They were printed on thick legal bond paper. I did not need to put my reading glasses on to know what they were. I had spent 40 years reading contracts. I knew the shape and structure of a financial takeover. I slowly picked up the stack and flipped to the second page. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon. Words leaped off the page. Fiduciary authority, irrevocable asset management, total banking authorization. This was not wedding vendor insurance. This was a broad financial power of attorney. If I signed that piece of paper, Trevor would have immediate legal access to every bank account, every investment portfolio, and every piece of real estate registered in my name. He would not even need to wait for the marriage certificate to drain my wealth. He was making his move right now. He wanted total control before the wedding guests even arrived. I looked up from the fraudulent documents and saw Rachel watching me with absolute desperate trust. She had no idea what she was handing me. She had not read a single word of the legal text because Trevor had assured her it was just boring wedding logistics. She believed she was protecting her aging father. She thought she was doing the right thing. Through the glass door of the kitchen, I saw Trevor leaning against the counter. He was sipping a glass of water, watching my every move with the casual arrogance of a predator waiting for the trap to snap shut. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought I was just a tired old man who would sign anything to make his daughter smile. My blood boiled with a rage so intense it physically hurt my chest. I wanted to tear those papers to shreds. I wanted to march into the kitchen and break his jaw. I wanted to shake my daughter and scream at her to wake up from this nightmare. But I remembered the plan I had made with Lawrence. If I fought back now, Trevor would play the victim. He would tell Rachel I was paranoid and hostile. He would use these very documents as proof that I was losing my grip on reality and lashing out at the people trying to help me. I would lose the only chance I had to catch him committing a federal crime. I had to let him think he won. I let my shoulders droop. I rubbed my eyes, acting as if the legal jargon was simply too confusing for my old brain to process. I offered Rachel a warm, weary smile. I tapped the papers gently and told her that she and Trevor were right. I said all this legal talk gave me a headache. I assured her that if signing these helped them manage the vendors and took the pressure off, I was happy to do it. Rachel let out a massive sigh of relief. A tear finally escaped and rolled down her cheek. She whispered a thank you and said they just wanted me to be healthy and relaxed for the big day. I pulled a pen from my shirt pocket. I looked at the signature line at the bottom of the final page. I knew that the second the ink dried, Trevor would run to the bank and attempt to clean me out. He was about to cross the line from a manipulative liar to a documented federal criminal. I pressed the tip of the pen to the paper and signed my name. The tip of my pen rested against the thick paper. The black ink began to bleed into the fibers, forming a tiny dark stain. I did not write my name immediately. I paused and looked up at my daughter. Rachel was watching my hand with wide, anxious eyes. She was holding her breath. In that fleeting second, the grown woman sitting across from me vanished. Instead, I saw a terrified 9-year-old girl standing in the pouring rain. I remembered the day we buried Diane. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and the wind was bitter cold. Rachel was wearing a small black dress that swallowed her fragile frame. She gripped my hand so tightly, her tiny knuckles turned white. She was terrified that the world was collapsing and that I would disappear too. She looked up at me with those same wide, anxious eyes, searching my face for any sign that we were going to survive the grief. I promised her that day that I would always protect her. I promised Diane I would never let anyone break our little girl. Looking at Rachel now, I realized how deeply I had failed to see the danger. Trevor had not just walked into our lives and asked for money. He had systematically located the deepest wounds in my daughter's heart and weaponized them. He saw the little girl who was terrified of losing her family, and he convinced her that the rest of the world was a threat. He played the role of the damaged survivor so she would pour all her protective love into him. He gaslighted her until she could not tell the difference between helping her father and handing him over to a predator. Rachel was not acting out of greed or malice. She was completely brainwashed. Trevor had isolated her from her friends and filled her head with lies about my declining health. He made her believe that giving him total financial control was the only way to save me from the stress of my own aging mind. She was offering me my own execution warrant because she genuinely believed it was a shield. Through the glass patio doors, I could still see Trevor leaning against the kitchen counter. He shifted his weight and crossed his arms over his chest. He was trying to look casual, but I could sense the raw, predatory tension radiating off him. He was a starving wolf watching a lamb walk directly into the slaughterhouse. He was waiting for me to sign away 40 years of sweat and sacrifice so he could hand it over to Douglas and Patricia Collins. To save my daughter, I had to become the exact victim Trevor needed me to be. I had to swallow my pride and let him believe he was the smartest man in the room. I let my hand shake. It was a subtle tremor, but enough to make the pen rattle against the glass table. I slackened my jaw and let my eyes glaze over with a manufactured, weary fog. I looked back down at the treacherous documents and pretended to lose my place on the page. I muttered something about the print being too small and the legal words giving me a terrible headache. Rachel leaned forward immediately. Her face was etched with deep, genuine concern. She softly told me that I did not need to read it all, and that Trevor had already reviewed every single line to make sure we were protected. She gently placed her hand over my shaking fingers and guided the pen back to the signature line. She promised me that everything was going to be fine and that I could just rest now. The sheer cruelty of Trevor using my daughter's love to seal my financial doom burned like acid in my throat. But I kept my face blank and confused. I pressed the pen down and slowly traced my signature across the bottom of the page. I made the letters slightly uneven, mimicking the degrading motor skills of a man losing his faculties. I flipped to the next page and signed again, and then the next. I handed over total banking authorization. I handed over irrevocable asset management. I handed over the keys to the empire I had built with Diane. When I finished the final page, I let the pen slip from my fingers and clatter onto the table. I slumped back in the patio chair, letting out a long, ragged sigh. I rubbed my temples and closed my eyes, acting completely exhausted by the simple task. Rachel gathered the papers quickly. She aligned the edges with trembling hands and let out a breath she had been holding for days. She leaned over and kissed my forehead, whispering that I was the best father in the world. She told me she was going to go put the papers in Trevor's briefcase so he could drop them off at the vendor office tomorrow morning. I nodded weakly and told her to go have fun with her fiancé. I kept my eyes half closed as I watched her walk back into the house. She handed the stack of signed documents to Trevor. Even from the patio, I could see the immediate shift in his posture. The casual leaning stance vanished. He snatched the papers from her hands with a hungry, desperate speed. He flipped straight to the signature pages, his eyes darting across the ink. When he saw my shaky, uneven signatures, a slow, triumphant smirk spread across his face. It was the vile, satisfied smile of a con artist who had just secured his payday. He pulled Rachel into a hug, kissing the top of her head while staring directly at me through the glass. His eyes were cold and victorious. He thought he had completely neutralized the only threat to his family's generational scam. I offered him a feeble, confused wave from my chair. He smiled back and gave me a patronizing thumbs up. He turned around and walked out of the kitchen with my daughter and my financial death warrant in his hands. He was probably already planning his trip to the bank. He was probably already imagining the phone call he would make to Douglas and Patricia, boasting about how easily the old man had fallen for the trap. I sat alone on the patio, listening to the quiet rustle of the wind in the trees. The tremor in my hands disappeared instantly. The fog in my eyes cleared, leaving behind a cold, razor-sharp focus. Trevor had his piece of paper, but he had absolutely no idea that he was playing checkers while I was restructuring the entire board. I stood up from the chair. My back did not ache, and my knees did not pop. I moved with the silent, steady strength of a man preparing for war. I needed to get to a secure location. I needed to sit down with Lawrence Blake and build a financial fortress so deep and so heavily fortified that Trevor would shatter his teeth trying to bite into it. The bait was officially in the water. Now it was time to build the trap. I waited 30 minutes after Rachel and Trevor left the house. I watched their car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street before I finally let the mask drop. The frail, confused old man vanished entirely. I walked to my study, locked the door, and picked up my secure phone. I called Lawrence Blake. "Lawrence," I said, my voice low and steady. "The bait has been taken. Trevor has the power of attorney documents. He thinks he has the keys to the kingdom." I heard Lawrence exhale sharply on the other end of the line. "George, you are playing with live ammunition now. We need to secure the perimeter before he realizes what he actually has. Meet me at the safe house in 45 minutes. Bring everything." The safe house was a nondescript brick building located in an industrial park on the outskirts of the city. It was officially registered to one of Lawrence's shell corporations. It was a place where sensitive corporate mergers were negotiated away from prying eyes and corporate espionage. Today, it was going to serve as the war room for the most important financial maneuver of my life. I parked my truck around the back and let myself in through the heavy steel door. The room was sparse. Just a large conference table, a few chairs, and a massive whiteboard. Lawrence was already there. He had his laptop open and stacks of legal files spread across the table. "Let us get straight to work," Lawrence said, not bothering to look up from his screen. "Trevor is arrogant, but he is not stupid. He will try to execute those documents the second the banks open tomorrow morning. We need to build a wall he cannot climb over." I sat down at the table and opened my briefcase. I pulled out 40 years' worth of financial history. Bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds. My entire $8 million estate was laid bare on the table. "This is what we are protecting," I said. "I built this from nothing. Trevor thinks he can just reach in and take it. I want to build a structure so complicated and so ironclad that he shatters his teeth trying to bite into it." Lawrence nodded, cracking his knuckles. "We are going to establish a honey trap trust, George. It is a highly specialized legal entity. We are going to move the true bulk of your $8 million estate into an irrevocable offshore trust. The primary beneficiary will still be Rachel, but the trust will be structured with impossible trigger conditions. No money moves without multiple layers of independent authorization." I leaned forward, analyzing the strategy. "So the power of attorney Trevor holds will be useless?" I asked. "Exactly," Lawrence confirmed, a grim smile playing on his lips. "A power of attorney only grants authority over assets directly in your name. If we move the assets into this specific offshore entity, they are no longer legally yours to give away. Trevor can wave that signed document around all he wants. The banks will laugh him out of the lobby. He will have total legal control over a completely empty vault." We spent the next 4 hours working furiously. I drew on my decades of corporate logistics experience mapping out complex asset transfers and dummy holding companies. We routed the money through a labyrinth of legal entities designed specifically to frustrate and exhaust anyone trying to trace it. It was an intense, exhausting process. I was literally restructuring my entire life's work in a single afternoon. Every signature, every notarized document felt like slamming a heavy steel door shut on Trevor's greedy fingers. By the time the sun began to set, the structure was complete. My $8 million estate was completely insulated. The offshore trust was active. The assets were locked away behind a legal firewall that no power of attorney could ever breach. Lawrence sat back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. It is done, George. Your wealth is secure. Trevor can scream and threaten all he wants, but he cannot touch a single dime. I looked at the towering stack of paperwork on the table. A cold, hard satisfaction settled in my chest. Trevor had tried to manipulate a grieving daughter. He had tried to exploit a tired widower. He had underestimated the man he was trying to rob. But this was only the first part of the plan. I did not just want to stop Trevor. I wanted to catch him. I wanted to expose him and his parents to the world. And to do that, I needed bait. Lawrence, I said, breaking the silence in the room. Now we need to build the decoy account. We need to give him something to steal. Something big enough to prove his intentions, but small enough that we can control the narrative. Lawrence nodded, a dangerous glint in his eye. Let us set the trap, George. Let us see how greedy this parasite really is. I looked across the table at Lawrence. We had successfully locked away the empire. Now we needed to build the illusion. Trevor had the legal documents in his hands, and he was going to walk into a bank expecting to find a fortune. If he found nothing, he would immediately know I was onto him. He would panic. He would grab Rachel and run. I could not let that happen. I needed him to feel the rush of victory. I needed him to commit a felony so large that he would never see the outside of a federal prison. Lawrence pulled up a new screen on his laptop. He told me we needed to establish a decoy checking account. It had to be a local bank. A bank that looked exactly like the kind of place a 70-year-old retired man would trust with his life savings. We chose a regional branch just a few miles from my house. It was the same bank where I kept a small personal checking account for household expenses. I told Lawrence to link the new power of attorney directly to that specific account. We made sure the routing numbers matched the documents Trevor was currently holding. When the bank tellers looked up my profile, they would see Trevor listed as my authorized fiduciary. The doors would be wide open for him. Then came the most important part of the trap: the bait. Lawrence asked me how much money we were going to sacrifice. I told him we were not sacrificing anything. We were making an investment in my daughter's future. I instructed him to wire exactly $100,000 from one of our clean holding companies into the decoy account. Lawrence raised an eyebrow. He asked if I was sure about that specific number. I told him I was absolutely sure. $100,000 was a very deliberate figure. If I put too much money in there, Trevor might get suspicious. A guy like me living in a nice house driving a regular truck should not have millions sitting in a basic checking account. But $100,000 looked perfect. It looked exactly like the liquidated life savings of a hardworking widower. It looked like a retirement nest egg. It was enough money to make a greedy parasite like Trevor salivate, but it was not enough to bankrupt me if the money somehow vanished. More importantly, I knew the law. $100,000 crossing state lines triggered massive federal penalties. It elevated the crime from a simple theft to major wire fraud. We spent the next hour making the account look authentic. Lawrence was a master at digital paper trails. He generated a realistic transaction history. We made it look like I had recently consolidated a few mutual funds into this central account to prepare for paying wedding expenses. We added small daily transactions: a charge at the local grocery store, a payment to the pharmacy, a deposit from a modest pension. Any bank manager looking at the screen would see the boring, predictable life of George Bennett. Trevor was going to walk into that bank, present his freshly signed documents, and see exactly what he wanted to see: a vulnerable old man with a fat stack of cash just waiting to be taken. Lawrence finished typing and closed his laptop with a soft thud. He told me the snare was officially set. The decoy account was live and fully funded. The power of attorney was registered in the system. But Lawrence did not stop there. He told me he had installed a silent digital tripwire on the account. He explained that the bank would not stop Trevor from taking the money. We wanted him to take the money. But the absolute second that those funds were transferred out of the account, Lawrence would receive a secure encrypted alert. We would know the exact moment the crime was committed. We would know the routing number of the receiving account. We would have a flawless, undeniable digital footprint of Trevor committing federal wire fraud. I stood up from the conference table and packed my files back into my briefcase. The exhaustion of the day was finally starting to catch up with me, but my mind was crystal clear. We had built a masterpiece. The Collins family thought they were running a sophisticated long con. They had no idea they had just stepped onto a financial landmine. Lawrence walked me to the heavy steel door of the safe house. He shook my hand and told me to go home and get some sleep. He warned me that the next few days were going to be the most dangerous part of the operation. He told me I had to go back to my house and look Trevor in the eye, knowing exactly what the man was planning to do. I had to maintain the facade of the helpless old victim until the trap snapped shut. I told Lawrence not to worry about my acting skills. I had 40 years of practice sitting across negotiating tables from men who wanted to ruin me. Trevor was just another cheap suit with a bad attitude. I walked out to my dusty pickup truck and climbed into the driver's seat. The drive back to my house was quiet. The sun had completely set, leaving the roads dark and empty. I thought about Rachel. I thought about how much pain she was going to feel when she finally saw the truth. It broke my heart to know that I had to let her world fall apart. But a broken heart can heal. A life chained to a predatory family like the Collins clan would destroy her forever. I pulled into my driveway and parked the truck. The lights in the house were off except for the soft glow of the porch lamp. Rachel and Trevor were probably asleep. They were probably dreaming about the wedding and the venue deposit. Trevor was probably dreaming about the fortune he was going to steal tomorrow. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was peaceful. I walked slowly up the stairs, playing the part of the tired old man perfectly, even when no one was watching. I went into my bedroom and lay down in the dark. The bait was in the water. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for the wolf to take the bite. 48 hours passed since I signed the fraudulent documents. 2 full days of playing the oblivious, decaying father. The house was a chaotic storm of floral arrangements, seating charts, and catering menus. Rachel was running on coffee and nervous energy, trying to make everything perfect. Trevor played the part of the supportive partner, but I could see the restless, greedy energy buzzing under his skin. He was like a starving dog staring at a locked meat locker. On Saturday morning, Trevor came down to the kitchen wearing a fresh tailored suit. He kissed Rachel on the cheek and told her he had to run a few errands downtown to finalize the groomsmen gifts. He poured himself a cup of my premium coffee, adjusted his silk tie, and gave me a wide, patronizing smile. He told me to rest my old bones and that he had everything under control. I smiled back and told him to drive safe. I watched him walk out the front door and climb into the luxury vehicle. I counted the seconds as he backed down the driveway. I knew exactly where he was going. He was not buying gifts for his groomsmen. He was heading straight for the local bank branch. His father had explicitly told him on the patio to wait until the marriage certificate was signed before draining the trust. Douglas Collins was a seasoned predator who understood patience, but Trevor was arrogant and deeply in debt. His massive credit card bills and impending civil lawsuits were breathing down his neck. His greed was too loud to wait for the wedding. I walked out to the backyard and sat on the wooden bench near my tomato garden. The morning air was crisp. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the prepaid secure phone. I stared at the blank screen, waiting for the digital tripwire to activate. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The anticipation was a heavy physical weight in my chest. If Trevor got spooked or if the bank manager asked the wrong question, he might back out. At exactly 42 minutes past 9, the prepaid phone vibrated in my palm. The screen lit up with a single incoming call from Lawrence Blake. I answered the call and pressed the phone to my ear. "We have a bite," Lawrence said, his deep voice crackling with pure adrenaline. The silent alarm just tripped. "He is inside the lobby of the regional branch right now." I stared at the green tomato vines and took a slow breath. "Tell me exactly what is happening," I said. Lawrence narrated the digital breadcrumbs as his monitoring software pulled the live banking data. He told me Trevor had presented the power of attorney documents to the branch manager. The legal team at the bank reviewed the signatures. They saw my shaky, uneven handwriting and verified the notary stamp Trevor had undoubtedly paid someone to forge or push through. The documents cleared their initial compliance check. "Did he see the balance?" I asked. "He saw it," Lawrence confirmed. He logged into the fiduciary portal using the authorization. He saw exactly $100,000 sitting in the checking account. I imagined the look on his face in that bank lobby. He probably expected to see millions. Finding only 100,000 might have disappointed him for a fraction of a second. But a desperate man drowning in debt does not walk away from $100,000 in liquid cash. He probably assumed it was just my active checking account and that he could hunt down the investment portfolios later. "Is he moving the money?" I asked, my grip tightening on the plastic phone. "He is not just moving it," George Lawrence said, his fingers typing rapidly in the background. "He is liquidating the entire account. He did not even try to be subtle. He did not withdraw small amounts to avoid suspicion. He authorized a single massive wire transfer for the full $100,000. The transaction is pending the final verification right now." We waited in silence on the open line. Moving money through the banking system is just like moving freight across the country. Every step requires a digital signature, a routing code, and a destination manifest. You cannot make $100,000 vanish into thin air. It leaves a wide, glowing trail for anyone who knows how to look. "The transfer just cleared," Lawrence announced, his voice turning cold and sharp. "The decoy account is completely empty. The balance is zero." "Where did he send it?" I demanded. Lawrence was quiet for a moment, while his specialized software traced the routing numbers across the banking network. The money left the local branch and crossed state lines immediately. It was processed through a clearinghouse in Delaware and then routed straight to an offshore financial institution in the Cayman Islands. "An offshore account," I repeated. "Yes," Lawrence said. "But my software tracks the corporate registration tied to the receiving account." Trevor did not send it to his own name. He wired the funds directly into a holding company registered as Pinecrest Holdings. I recognized the naming convention immediately. It was the same arrogant style used in the documents I found in my basement archives. "Run the director names for Pinecrest Holdings," I instructed. "I am already in their corporate registry," Lawrence replied. "The shell company was established 4 months ago. There is only one primary registered director listed on the offshore incorporation documents." "Let me guess," I said, feeling a dark satisfaction settle over me. "Douglas Collins." "You hit the nail on the head," George Lawrence confirmed. The money landed directly in the lap of Douglas Collins. The father and son team executed the heist exactly as they planned. Trevor used the fraudulent power of attorney to bypass the bank security, and Douglas provided the offshore bucket to catch the stolen cash. I stood up from the wooden bench and looked up at the clear blue sky. The trap had officially snapped shut. The metal teeth had crushed their bones, and they did not even realize they were bleeding yet. By moving $100,000 across state lines and routing it to an offshore shell company, Trevor had elevated his actions far beyond a simple domestic dispute. This was no longer just a case of a greedy fiancé taking advantage of a confused old man. "Lawrence," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "What is the exact legal definition of what Trevor just did?" Lawrence did not hesitate. "The moment that money crossed the state line, the jurisdiction transferred to the federal government. By using electronic banking channels to execute a fraudulent transfer based on deceptive intent, Trevor and Douglas Collins have officially committed federal wire fraud. It is a major felony. We have the signed documents, the bank surveillance timestamps, the routing numbers, and the offshore receiving receipts. It is a flawless closed loop of criminal evidence. Lock the data down," I told him. "Print every single receipt. Back up the audio file from the patio intercept and package it with the 15-year-old pension fraud documents from the archives. We have the complete historical pattern and the current active crime. I will build the dossier right now," Lawrence promised. "What is your status at the house?" "I am going to walk back inside and pour myself another cup of coffee," I said. "I am going to sit in my armchair and wait for the boy to come home." I am going to look him right in the eye while he pretends to love my daughter. Be careful, George Lawrence warned. He thinks he has all your money now. He thinks you are entirely powerless. Desperate men get dangerous when they think they have won. I am not the one in danger, Lawrence, I replied. I hung up the secure phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I walked back across the manicured lawn toward my quiet house. Trevor had his $100,000. He had his temporary victory, but he had just sold his entire future and the freedom of his parents for a fraction of my wealth. He belonged to the federal prison system now. I just had to wait for the perfect moment to deliver the sentence. I walked back into the house and went straight to the kitchen. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the small island counter. I waited in the quiet house. I knew Rachel was upstairs, resting from the wedding planning stress. I knew Trevor would be walking through the front door very soon. I needed to be sitting exactly where he could find me. The heavy front door clicked open. Trevor walked into the foyer. He did not call out for Rachel like he normally did to announce his charming presence. He walked into the kitchen and stopped. His posture was completely different. The polite, deferential stoop he usually wore around me was gone. He was standing tall with his chest pushed out and his shoulders relaxed. He looked exactly like a man who had just won the lottery and no longer needed to pretend to be a decent human being. He walked over to the sink and poured himself a glass of filtered water. He did not offer me a polite smile. He just stared at me. His eyes were cold, dark, and entirely predatory. "Rachel is asleep," he said softly. His tone was not friendly or conversational. It was flat and commanding. I nodded slowly and gripped my coffee mug with trembling hands. I asked him if his errands downtown went well. He chuckled. It was a dark and mocking sound that echoed in the quiet kitchen. "They went perfectly, George. I had a very productive morning securing our future." He took a slow step closer to me. He leaned against the marble counter, invading my personal space. He looked down at me like I was an insect he was debating whether or not to crush. He let the silence stretch out, allowing his physical presence to dominate the room. "You know," George, Trevor said, keeping his voice low so it would not carry up the stairs. "Rachel and I have been talking a lot about your future. We are very worried about your cognitive decline." I widened my eyes and let my hands shake a little more, making the coffee ripple in the mug. I told him I was feeling fine and that I just needed some rest before the wedding. Trevor shook his head slowly. "No, George. You are not fine. You are slipping. You are becoming a danger to yourself. And quite frankly, you are becoming a massive burden to Rachel." I slumped my shoulders and looked down at the floor. I played the part of a broken man hearing his absolute worst fear spoken aloud by the person taking away his daughter. Trevor leaned in closer. I could smell the expensive cologne he had undoubtedly purchased using the credit cards he maxed out. "We cannot have you ruining the start of our marriage," he whispered. "Rachel is too sweet to say it to your face, but she is exhausted. Taking care of a decaying old man is destroying her mental health. So I am going to step up and make the hard decisions for her as the man of the house." I looked up at him with manufactured terror shining in my eyes. I asked him what he meant by that. Trevor smiled. It was a vicious, satisfied smile that showed all his teeth. "Immediately after we return from our honeymoon," he said smoothly, "we are going to move you into a specialized care facility, a state-run home where professionals can watch you around the clock." I let out a weak gasp. A state-run facility meant a low-income, poorly funded institution. It was a dumping ground for the forgotten, where the floors smelled like bleach and the doors locked from the outside. I begged him not to do that. I told him this was my home. I told him I built this house for Diane and Rachel with my own 2 hands. Trevor laughed quietly. "You do not build anything anymore, George. You are just taking up space. And honestly, a state-run facility is exactly what you deserve. They have linoleum floors and locked doors. You will fit right in perfectly." I pushed my chair back slightly, acting like I was trying to physically escape his looming presence. I raised my voice just a fraction. I told him he could not do that to me. I said I would hire a lawyer. I told him I would fight him in court, and that Rachel would never allow him to lock me away in a place like that. Trevor did not flinch. He did not back away. He stepped right up to my chair and placed his heavy hand on the armrests, physically trapping me in place. He leaned down until his face was only inches from mine. I could see the absolute lack of a soul in his eyes. "You are not going to hire a lawyer, George," Trevor whispered, his voice dripping with absolute malice. "Lawyers cost money. Good lawyers cost a lot of money, and as of this morning you do not have a single dime to your name." I let my mouth fall open. I stared at him with perfect orchestrated horror. I asked him what he had done. Trevor tapped my cheek lightly with 2 fingers. It was the most degrading, disrespectful gesture I had ever experienced in my 70 years on this earth. "I did my job as your legal fiduciary," he mocked. "I protected your assets by moving them to a secure location where your confused old mind cannot squander them. You signed the paperwork, George. You gave me the keys. Your accounts are completely empty. You are officially bankrupt." I let out a loud sob. It was a pathetic, broken sound. I buried my face in my trembling hands and let my shoulders heave. I acted exactly like a man whose entire world had just been violently ripped away from him by a cruel thief. Trevor patted my shoulder. It was a firm and bruising touch meant to assert dominance. "Do not fight it, George," he commanded softly. "If you try to tell Rachel what happened, I will simply show her the documents you signed. I will tell her your dementia is making you paranoid and hostile. She will believe me because I am her future, and you are just a decaying ghost from her past. You have lost. Accept it quietly, and maybe I will let Rachel visit you on holidays." He stood up straight, picked up his glass of water, and walked out of the kitchen. He did not look back. He whistled a cheerful tune as he headed up the stairs to check on my daughter. I kept my face buried in my hands until the sound of his footsteps disappeared completely. I waited until I heard the guest room door click shut on the 2nd floor. Then I slowly lowered my hands. There were no tears on my face. My hands were perfectly still. The trembling was gone completely. Trevor thought he had just delivered the killing blow. He thought he had completely neutralized the only threat to his generational scam. He believed his own lie so thoroughly that he could not see the massive steel trap closing around his throat. In my 40 years of business, I had negotiated against ruthless mobsters and cutthroat executives. Real predators never gloat this early. Real predators never show their hand until the ink is completely dry and the money is buried deep. Trevor was just a cheap amateur playing a game he did not understand. He had just admitted to draining my accounts. He had admitted to planning my forced institutionalization. He had threatened me in my own home, and he had done it all while believing he was entirely untouchable. I stood up from the kitchen stool. I walked over to the sink and poured the cold coffee down the drain. My mind was sharp and cold. Trevor had taken the bait, and now he was happily drowning in his own arrogance. It was time to pull the net tight and let Lawrence drop the federal hammer on the entire Collins family. I stood in the center of the kitchen, listening to the faint sound of Trevor walking around on the 2nd floor. I kept my shoulders slumped and my head bowed just in case he decided to peer down the staircase to gloat one last time. I waited until the floorboards stopped creaking. I waited until I heard the shower turn on in the guest bathroom. The rushing water was my signal that I was completely alone. I straightened my back. I took a deep, slow breath and let the facade of the helpless victim wash away down the drain with my cold coffee. Trevor thought he had left a broken man in his wake. He had no idea he had just turned his back on the executioner. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the secure prepaid phone. The screen illuminated the dim corners of the kitchen. I opened my messages and pulled up the encrypted chat thread I shared with Lawrence Blake. I did not need to type out a long explanation. We had rehearsed this protocol for days. I tapped out a single word. Execute. I hit send. I watched the tiny delivery checkmark appear on the screen. It was such a small, simple action, but it carried the weight of a nuclear strike. I knew exactly what was happening on the other side of the city the moment Lawrence received that message. He was sitting in the secure safe house surrounded by hard drives and heavily encrypted servers. He was not calling the local police department. Local cops deal with stolen televisions and bar fights. When someone moves $100,000 across state lines into a Caribbean shell company, you do not call a patrol officer. You call the federal government. Lawrence had spent 25 years building relationships with the exact kind of people who wear cheap suits and carry federal badges. He had a direct private line to a senior agent in the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI. Lawrence compiled the digital dossier we had meticulously built. It was a masterpiece of legal destruction. First, he attached the high-resolution banking records proving Trevor had used a fraudulent document to liquidate my decoy account. Second, he attached the routing numbers tracing the stolen money directly to the offshore holding company registered to Douglas Collins. That single document proved conspiracy and collusion across state lines, transforming a simple theft into a federal operation. Third, he uploaded the historical archives proving Douglas and Patricia Collins were the exact same predators who had bankrupted my late wife's father 15 years ago. It established a documented generational pattern of organized financial abuse. And finally, Lawrence attached the audio file. The crystal-clear recording of Trevor standing on his parents' luxury patio, handing over Diane's stolen diamond necklace, and laughing about draining my family trust. Lawrence pressed send and forwarded the entire pristine package directly to the federal authorities. There was no room for Trevor to claim it was a misunderstanding. There was no gray area for a clever defense attorney to exploit. We handed the FBI a completely closed loop of undeniable felony evidence wrapped up with a neat little bow. The crime of wire fraud carries a 20-year federal prison sentence per count. Interstate extortion carries another 20. Trevor and his parents were looking at the absolute end of their lives as free citizens. And the beautiful part was that they were entirely oblivious to the federal hammer descending from the sky. I slipped the prepaid phone back into my pocket and walked out of the kitchen. I moved through the house with a profound sense of peace. I watched the caterers arrive to drop off the serving trays for the weekend. I signed for the floral deliveries with a steady hand. Every time I saw Rachel, my heart ached, but the pain was tempered by the absolute certainty that I was saving her life. She was running around the living room, checking guest lists and confirming seating charts for the rehearsal dinner that evening. She looked so tired, but she offered me a warm, grateful smile whenever we made eye contact. She believed her future was starting tomorrow. I knew her nightmare was ending tonight. I helped her carry a box of centerpieces to the dining room. She asked me if I was feeling okay after signing all the vendor paperwork earlier. She said she hoped it took some of the pressure off my shoulders. I looked into her beautiful, trusting eyes and told her that I had never felt more relieved. I told her that a massive weight had finally been lifted and that tonight was going to be a celebration no one would ever forget. She hugged me tightly, thanking me for being so supportive of her and Trevor. Wrapping my arms around my daughter, I silently promised her that she would never have to be afraid of that monster again. Trevor finally came downstairs an hour later. He was dressed in a sharp navy blue suit for the rehearsal dinner. He smelled like expensive aftershave and unearned arrogance. He walked into the living room and wrapped his arms around my daughter, kissing her cheek. He looked over her shoulder and made direct eye contact with me. He offered me a tight, subtle smirk. It was the look of a man reminding a prisoner to stay in his cell. I offered him a weak, trembling nod in return. I let him bask in his imaginary supremacy. He was a dead man walking, and he did not even know the ground beneath his feet had already collapsed into a federal grave. I went upstairs to my master bedroom to get dressed for the evening. I pulled out my best charcoal gray suit, the same suit I wore to board meetings when I was about to dismantle a rival corporation. I tied my silk tie and polished my leather shoes. I looked at myself in the mirror. The weary, broken father was gone. The logistics baron was back in full force. I checked my gold pocket watch. The federal agents had the dossier. The grand jury subpoenas were probably already being drafted by hungry prosecutors. All that was left was the final presentation. Trevor wanted to be the center of attention. He wanted to be the star of the weekend. I was going to give him an audience he would never, ever forget. The ballroom of the country club was bathed in the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved silently between the tables, pouring expensive champagne into tall glass flutes. The room was packed with my extended family, my former business partners, and Rachel's childhood friends. The entire left side of the banquet hall, however, was completely empty. Trevor had refused to invite a single person. He played the role of the tragic abandoned orphan to absolute perfection, keeping up the illusion that he had no one in the world but my daughter. I sat at the head table cutting into my roasted tenderloin. I chewed my food mechanically. The rich, heavy meal tasted like ash in my mouth. To my right, Rachel was glowing. She wore a stunning white evening gown and leaned her head against Trevor's shoulder. To my left sat a few of my oldest friends' men who had helped me build my logistics empire from the dirt. They were laughing and enjoying the celebration, completely unaware that the groom sitting 10 feet away was actively trying to bankrupt me and lock me in a state-run nursing home. The string quartet stopped playing. The low hum of conversation faded as Trevor stood up from his chair. He picked up a silver spoon and tapped it gently against his champagne flute. The clear, sharp ringing commanded the attention of the entire room. He buttoned his custom-tailored suit, a suit paid for by the credit cards he had maxed out, and picked up the heavy silver microphone. He looked out over the crowd with a practiced, humble smile. He started his speech by thanking everyone for welcoming him into their lives. He spun his web of lies for an audience of 100 people. He talked about his dark, abusive childhood. He lowered his voice, making it sound thick with manufactured emotion. He told the room that he never knew what a real, loving family looked like until he met Rachel. Then he turned his dead shark eyes toward me. He raised his glass and directed the attention of the entire room to where I was sitting. He called me a generous man. He called me a titan of industry who was now fading into his twilight years. He put his hand on his heart and told the crowd how difficult the last few months had been on my declining health. He painted a picture of a confused, ailing father who could barely manage his own affairs. Trevor looked right at me and promised everyone in that room that he was going to take over my burdens. He swore he would protect me and care for me in my final fragile years. He said it was his absolute honor to take the reins. The crowd actually wiped away tears. I heard my own sister sniffle from the table nearest the stage. Rachel looked up at Trevor like he was a saint descended directly from heaven. She reached out and squeezed his hand, wiping a tear from her cheek. Trevor looked back at me over the rim of his glass with a smug, victorious smirk. He thought he had completely buried me in front of my own family. He thought he was reading my eulogy while drinking my champagne. I placed my linen napkin on the table. I grabbed my walking cane. I did not actually need the cane, but it added a beautiful touch of fragile theater to my performance. I stood up slowly, letting my knees tremble just a fraction to sell the illusion. The room fell dead silent. Everyone was waiting for the tired old widower to give away his only child. I reached out and took the microphone from Trevor. His fingers brushed against mine, and they were ice cold. He offered me a patronizing nod and stepped back, allowing me to take the center of the stage. I looked out at the sea of expectant faces. I started softly, keeping my voice low and heavily textured with emotion. I talked about Diane. I told the room how much her mother would have loved to be here tonight, to see our little girl in her white dress. I looked at Rachel and told her how incredibly proud I was of the strong, beautiful woman she had become. Then I turned my body slowly to face Trevor. I let the grandfatherly warmth drain completely out of my voice. The fragile tremble in my knees vanished. I stood up perfectly straight, squaring my shoulders. I told the crowd that a father only wants one thing for his daughter when he hands her away. He wants to know exactly who she is marrying. I looked right into Trevor's arrogant eyes. I thanked him. I thanked him for coming into my house and showing me his true colors. I thanked him for pulling back the curtain on his life and proving exactly what kind of man he was when he thought nobody was watching. Trevor frowned. His victorious smirk faltered for half a second. He shifted his weight uncomfortably. He did not understand the sudden cold shift in my tone or the absolute steel in my posture. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my charcoal suit. I did not pull out a handkerchief to wipe away tears. I pulled out a small black remote control. I turned toward the massive white projector screen hanging directly behind the head table. I raised my arm, pointing the remote at the digital projector suspended from the ceiling. I told the room that I had prepared a special presentation. I told them it was a collection of memories that would ensure nobody in this room ever forgot who Trevor truly was. I pressed the single button on the small black remote. The crystal chandeliers above us dimmed, casting the expansive ballroom into a hushed, intimate darkness. Behind me, the massive digital projector hummed to life, throwing a square of brilliant white light against the far wall. The guests murmured with polite anticipation, settling into their chairs. The first image flashed onto the screen. It was a photograph of Rachel when she was 7 years old, missing her 2 front teeth covered in mud and holding up a trophy from her summer soccer league. A collective warm sound of adoration swept through the banquet hall. I clicked the remote again. A picture of Rachel at her high school graduation, standing proudly next to her mother, Diane. I spoke into the microphone, keeping my voice steady and thick with manufactured nostalgia. I told the room that watching my daughter grow up had been the greatest privilege of my life. I said that as a father, you spend your entire existence trying to protect your child from the cruelties of the world. You try to teach them to be kind, to be trusting, and to look for the good in people. Rachel was smiling, her eyes glistening with tears. Trevor was leaning back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the back of Rachel's seat. He had relaxed completely. He thought this was exactly what it looked like, a harmless, sappy presentation from a defeated old man trying to cling to his fading relevance. I told the crowd that marriage is built on absolute truth. I said that when 2 people bring their lives together, there can be no shadows and no locked doors. I clicked the remote. The screen went black for 2 full seconds. The silence in the room stretched, pulling the tension tight. When the next image snapped onto the screen, the soft, nostalgic sighs vanished entirely. It was a crisp, high-resolution telephoto shot. It did not show a birthday party or a graduation. It showed a sprawling $2 million estate with massive stone pillars and a circular driveway. I clicked the remote again. The next slide showed the luxury SUV I had purchased for Rachel parked perfectly in that driveway. Trevor was stepping out of the driver's side door, wearing an expensive linen shirt and designer jeans. A murmur of confusion rippled through the banquet hall. People were squinting at the screen, trying to understand why they were looking at surveillance photos. Trevor dropped his arm from Rachel's chair. He sat up perfectly straight. His face lost every drop of its color. I clicked the remote one more time. The image filled the massive screen in undeniable, crystal-clear definition. It was a close-up shot of the back patio. Trevor was standing in the warm glow of the outdoor lighting, holding a crystal glass of expensive liquor. He was throwing his head back in a roar of laughter, wrapping his arms in a warm, tight embrace around an elegantly dressed blonde woman and a broad-shouldered, smiling man. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the silent ballroom, cold and sharp as a razor. I introduced the crowd to the people on the screen. I said their names slowly. Douglas and Patricia Collins. I looked down at Rachel. She was staring at the glowing screen, her mouth slightly open, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. She did not understand what she was looking at. I told the room the exact story Trevor had told my daughter. I recounted the tale of the abusive, destitute monsters who had ruined his childhood. I repeated his claims that he had been forced to cut them out of his life completely to survive. I pointed to the screen and asked the room if the people laughing and drinking expensive scotch on a $2 million patio looked like estranged off-the-grid monsters. The banquet hall went dead silent. the kind of silence where you can hear the blood rushing in your own ears. Nobody moved. Nobody took a breath. My oldest friends at the side table were staring at Trevor with eyes that could cut through steel. Trevor opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked like a deer trapped in the headlights of a speeding freight train. He tried to reach out to touch Rachel's arm, but she instinctively pulled away, never taking her eyes off the glowing image of her fiancé, hugging the parents he claimed were dead to him. I did not give him a chance to recover. I did not give him a single second to spin a lie. I clicked the remote again. The smiling faces of the Collins family vanished. They were replaced by a stark white document. It was a banking record blown up to massive proportions so that every single letter and number was legible to the very back of the room. The logo of the local bank sat boldly at the top of the page. The date printed on the transfer was from exactly 2 days ago. I read the document aloud into the microphone. I read the amount first. $100,000. I let the number hang in the air. Then I read the authorization signature. I read Trevor's full name. I explained to the silent room that Trevor had used a fraudulent power of attorney document to bypass bank security and liquidate my decoy checking account. I clicked the remote again, zooming in on the destination routing information. I read the name of the receiving account. Pinecrest Holdings. I told the room that the money was wired across state lines to an offshore shell company registered directly to Douglas Collins, the same man standing on the patio in the previous photograph. Trevor began to shake. His chest heaved as he hyperventilated. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an exit, searching for a friendly face, but finding absolutely nothing but horrified, disgusted stares. I looked down at my daughter. Rachel was trembling. She stared at the giant numbers on the screen and the unmistakable name of the man sitting next to her. The massive psychological wall Trevor had built around her, the gaslighting, the isolation, the tragic lies, it all crumbled in a single devastating instant. The horrific reality of what she had almost married crashed down on her shoulders. She had a crystal champagne flute resting lightly in her hand. Her fingers went completely numb. The heavy glass slipped from her grip. It hit the polished hardwood floor and shattered into 100 glittering pieces. The sound cracked through the dead silent ballroom like a gunshot. Rachel pushed her chair back violently and stood up. She looked at Trevor, her face a mask of absolute pure betrayal. The terrified, manipulated girl was gone completely. The fierce, sharp woman I had raised was finally waking up. I had showed her the pictures. I had showed her the stolen money. Now there was only one thing left to do. I had to let her hear his voice. I had to let her hear exactly what he thought of her when he believed nobody was listening. I looked at my daughter standing there amidst the shattered glass. I needed her to hear the final piece of the truth. I pointed the remote at the projection system one last time and pressed the final button. The bright white screen faded to black. For a brief second, the room was completely silent. Then a sharp crackle of static echoed through the massive overhead speakers of the banquet hall. The sound was instantly followed by voices. They were crystal clear and amplified for every single guest to hear. The first voice belonged to Patricia Collins. She was gasping and admiring something beautiful. She asked if the diamonds were real. Then Trevor spoke. His voice boomed through the room, dripping with an arrogant sneer. He bragged that they were vintage-cut diamonds that belonged to Rachel and her dead mother. He laughed and boasted about taking the velvet box right out of my safe. He called me a clueless old fool who would not notice the missing heirloom for months. A collective gasp swept through the banquet hall. Several of my older business partners stood up from their chairs. Rachel covered her mouth with both hands. Her eyes were wide with a devastating mix of horror and heartbreak. She looked at the man she almost married, realizing he had stolen her mother's most sacred possession, just for sport. The audio continued to play mercilessly. The deep, booming laugh of Douglas Collins rattled the crystal chandeliers. He told Trevor not to push his luck before the ink was dry. He reminded his son that the venue check was just the beginning. Then came the words that sealed their fate entirely. Douglas ordered Trevor to keep the girl isolated until the marriage certificate was signed. He promised that the moment it became official, they would drain the family trust dry. Trevor snapped out of his paralyzed shock. The sound of his own voice confessing to federal crimes sent him into a blind panic. He started screaming that it was all fake and that the audio was completely fabricated. He scrambled away from the head table, knocking over his chair. He lunged toward the corner of the room where the audiovisual equipment was stacked. He climbed over a decorative table, ripping flower arrangements to the floor and desperately clawing at the thick black cables. He yanked the power cord straight out of the wall socket. The speakers popped loudly and went dead. The recording stopped, but the silence that followed was even more damning. The damage was absolute. 100 pairs of eyes stared at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. Trevor stood there, breathing heavily, clutching the torn cables in his hands. He turned around to face the crowd, trying to formulate another lie. He opened his mouth to speak, but he never got the chance. The heavy oak doors at the back of the banquet hall swung open with a massive, echoing thud. The doors hit the wall so hard the sound made several guests jump. Lawrence Blake stepped into the room. He was not wearing a celebratory suit. He wore a dark trench coat and a look of cold, professional satisfaction. He did not come alone. Flanking him on either side were 4 uniformed local police officers. Behind them walked 3 men in sharp windbreakers bearing the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The crowd parted immediately. People stepped back, pressing themselves against the walls to clear a wide path down the center aisle. The officers marched forward with heavy, purposeful steps. Trevor dropped the cables. His chest heaved as he looked at the federal badges. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified child. He took a step backward until his back hit the wall. Lawrence stopped in front of the head table. He looked directly at Trevor and spoke in a booming voice that carried effortlessly across the silent room. He told Trevor that the game was officially over. Lawrence then turned slightly to address the room. He announced that Douglas and Patricia Collins had been secretly sitting in the hotel lobby bar, drinking martinis and waiting to celebrate the successful infiltration of the Bennett family. He informed Trevor that his parents were currently being escorted to federal transport vehicles in handcuffs. They were already under arrest for conspiracy and wire fraud. Trevor looked wildly around the room, looking for any possible way out. He locked eyes with Rachel and begged her to tell them it was a mistake. He took a sudden, desperate step toward her, reaching out with his hands. He never made it past the head table. The federal agents moved with terrifying speed. 2 of them lunged forward and grabbed Trevor by the shoulders. He tried to twist away, thrashing and shouting that he did not do anything wrong. The agents did not hesitate. They grabbed him by the lapels of his custom suit and threw him forward. Trevor crashed hard onto the nearest banquet table. Porcelain plates shattered into pieces. Silverware clattered loudly against the floor. Crystal glasses toppled over, spilling red wine across the pristine white linen tablecloth. The agents pinned him face down against the ruined table. They wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic clicking of heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the silent banquet hall. It was a cold, final sound. Trevor stopped struggling. He pressed his cheek against the spilled wine and began to sob. It was not a calculated performance to gain pity. It was the pathetic, broken sound of a predator realizing he had walked directly into a fatal trap. The federal agents hauled him up to his feet. His designer suit was stained and torn. His arrogant swagger was entirely gone. He stood there humiliated and exposed in front of the entire bridal party, the extended family, and the woman he tried to destroy. I watched him stand there in chains, knowing he would not see the outside of a federal prison for a very long time. The execution was complete. The cancer had been removed from my family. Now I just had to look at my daughter and begin the process of putting our lives back together. The federal agents held Trevor firmly by his ruined suit jacket. His face was stained with red wine, and his hands were locked tightly behind his back. But even with the absolute proof of his crimes projected on a massive screen and echoing through the speakers, he still tried to lie. He looked at Rachel with desperate, panicked eyes. He started babbling frantically. He told her it was all a giant misunderstanding. He claimed I had faked the audio recordings to frame him because I was jealous of their love. He begged her to tell the police to let him go, swearing that he would never do anything to hurt her. He was still trying to play the victim. He was still trying to use her empathy as a shield. But the spell was completely broken. Rachel did not shrink back. She did not cry. She stepped over the shattered pieces of her champagne flute and walked directly up to him. She looked at the man who had isolated her from her friends, gaslighted her into thinking her father was losing his mind, and planned to strip her family of everything they had built. She looked at the pathetic lying thief standing before her. She raised her hand and delivered a slap so hard it sounded like a whip cracking across the silent banquet hall. Trevor's head snapped to the side. The blow left a bright red mark across his cheek. He blinked in stunned silence, finally realizing that his primary weapon was gone. Rachel did not say a single word to him. She did not need to. She just turned her back on him and walked away. The federal agents did not hesitate. They grabbed Trevor by the arms and dragged him backward down the center aisle. He started shouting and crying as they hauled him out of the ballroom. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, cutting off his pathetic pleas. The toxic parasite was finally gone from our lives. The moment the doors closed, the adrenaline that had been holding Rachel together completely vanished. Her shoulders slumped and her knees buckled. I moved faster than I had in 20 years. I stepped forward and caught my daughter before she hit the floor. I pulled her into a tight, protective embrace, holding her against my chest. She buried her face in my shoulder and broke down. She cried for the illusion she had lost, and for the horrific reality she had almost married. I stroked her hair and whispered that she was safe now. I promised her that nobody was ever going to hurt her again. I told her I had her, and I was never going to let her go. 1 year has passed since that night in the country club ballroom. The seasons have changed, and so have our lives. The federal justice system moves slowly, but it moves with absolute crushing certainty. Trevor Douglas and Patricia Collins did not even make it to a trial. When Lawrence and the federal prosecutors presented the mountain of undeniable evidence, including the offshore wire transfers, the audio intercepts, and the historical documents from 15 years ago, their high-priced defense attorneys told them to plead guilty. They are all currently serving 20-year sentences in federal penitentiaries. They tried to build a generational empire by stealing from innocent families, but they will spend the rest of their lives wearing prison uniforms and eating off metal trays. As for the Bennett Family Trust, it remains completely untouched. The $8 million sits safely behind the ironclad legal walls Lawrence and I built in that safe house. The decoy account was fully refunded by the federal government after they seized the offshore shell company. Trevor did not get to keep a single dime. But the most beautiful part of this entire ordeal is not the money I saved. It is the woman my daughter became. Rachel did not let the betrayal break her. She took the pain and the anger and she forged it into absolute steel. She realized that she had been targeted because of her trusting nature, and she decided she was never going to be a victim again. She threw herself into the family business. She learned every route, every contract, and every shipping manifest. Today she sits in the corner office as the vice president of my logistics company. She is sharp, she is vigilant, and she is absolutely unmanipulatable. I watch her negotiate with cutthroat union bosses and corporate executives, and I see the exact same fire in her eyes that her mother Diane used to have. Nobody talks down to her, and absolutely nobody gets past her defenses. Sometimes on quiet Sunday afternoons, we sit together on the back patio and drink coffee. We do not talk about Trevor or his family of thieves. We talk about freight routes and expansion plans. We talk about the future. I look at her and I know that when my time finally comes, the empire Diane and I built will be in the safest hands possible. I played the part of a weak, forgetful old man to expose a predator. I risked everything to spring a trap. But looking back at the entire nightmare, I know the ultimate victory was never about keeping the $8 million in the bank. The true victory was getting my daughter back. I saved her from a lifetime of manipulation and abuse. And in return, she found her own strength. If you enjoyed this story, let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. Have you ever had to step up and protect your family from someone they thought they loved? Tell me your experiences. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so I can keep bringing you more stories about family truth and justice. Thank you for your time and your support. Stay safe and always trust your instincts.